I found her address in the autumn of 1908. I had been looking for 45 years. The address was written on a piece of paper that a woman in Winchester handed me across a kitchen table, and I held it in both hands and did not speak for a long time. And the woman watched me with the careful attention of someone who understands that they have just handed another person something that weighs more than paper. I want you to understand what 45 years of looking feels like before I tell you what happened when I finally found what I was looking for. Because the finding is not the whole story. The looking is the story. The looking was my life. My name is Elizabeth Margaret Holloway, born Sutton, in the year 1843 in Clark County, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. I am 71 years old as I speak these words, and I have lived long enough to know that most stories do not end the way you spend your life expecting them to end. I knew this before 1908. I know it more completely now. I was the second child of Robert and Margaret Sutton, born and raised on a farm in the Northern Valley, where the land is limestone country, good for wheat and apple orchards, and the raising of horses. My father was a quiet man who expressed himself through his work, through the condition of the fences, and the straightness of the furrows, and the state of the barn at the end of a hard season. My mother was a woman of strong opinions and stronger loyalties who taught me to read before I started school, and who believed more firmly than most people around her that a woman's mind deserved to be used and not merely decorated. These two people made me what I was, and what I was shaped every decision I made in the years that followed, including the decision I have thought about every day since I made it. I grew up in a house full of books, and the smell of bread on Saturday mornings, and the sound of my father's boots on the porch steps at dusk. We were not wealthy in the way the Great Valley families were wealthy, but we were comfortable, and comfort of the right kind is worth more than people who have never had to do without it tend to understand. The valley in those years had a quality of settled, ordinary life that I have found nowhere else since, and I did not fully understand how rare it was until it was gone. I was the second of 4 children. My brother James was 3 years older, my sister Ruth 2 years younger, and my brother Thomas the youngest, born in 1851, a lively and affectionate child who grew into a lively and affectionate young man, and who died at Spotsylvania in May of 1864, in the second year of a war he had not wanted and had gone to anyway because he did not see another way he could live with himself. My mother never fully recovered from this. My father recovered by working harder than he had ever worked, as though the farm required his absolute attention in order to keep existing, and perhaps it did. The valley in the years of my childhood was one of the most peaceful places I have ever known. I say this not to make you grieve for what was lost, though grief seems the appropriate response, but to establish what the world looked like before it changed, because change is only fully understood against the thing it replaced. We knew our neighbors, and they knew us. The seasons followed each other in their reliable order. The work was hard and honest, and the results of it were visible in the condition of the land, which rewarded careful attention with a consistency that I have come to appreciate more as I have gotten older and understood how rare that consistency is. I married Thomas Holloway in April of 1862. He was from Loudoun County, dark-haired, and still in the way of men who prefer to observe before they speak, a quality I recognized and trusted. We had known each other 8 months when we married, which was not a long time, but the war had a way of compressing ordinary timelines. Everyone understood, without quite saying it aloud, that the ordinary future could not be counted on, and so people made decisions they might otherwise have taken years to arrive at. The war had been going for a year when we married. Thomas enlisted in July of 1862, 3 months after our wedding. I stood at the gate in the early morning and watched him walk down the road toward the muster point until I could not see him anymore, and then I went back into the house and sat at the kitchen table and tried to understand what it meant to be a married woman whose husband had just walked away into a war. Eleanor was conceived before he left. I did not know this when he walked away. I learned it 6 weeks later and wrote to him immediately, and his answer came 3 weeks after that, full of a happiness so clear it came through the handwriting itself, as though the words were not quite enough to contain it. He wrote that he would be home before the child was born. He wrote that he intended to hold his child before winter. Eleanor arrived in March of 1863 in a labor that lasted 17 hours, attended by my mother, and when it was finally over and the child was placed in my arms, I understood for the first time what it means to love something completely and without reservation. She was 8 pounds and dark-haired like her father, and she had my mother's gray eyes, clear and very steady, and she had a way of tilting her head when she looked at something that was entirely her own, a particular angle of attention that I have never seen in another person in all the years since. Thomas came home on furlough in June of 1863 and held his daughter for 4 days. He was thinner, and there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, a wariness that did not fully leave him even in the evenings when he sat with Eleanor in his arms by the kitchen window and watched her sleep. But he was still Thomas. He told me on the last night that he was coming back, that we were going to be all right. I believe he meant it. I believe he said it because it was true as far as he could see, and because he loved me and did not want to add to my fear. He was killed at Gettysburg on the 3rd of July, 1863. Eleanor was 4 months old. The letter from his commanding officer arrived in August, and I sat at the kitchen table with it in my hands for a very long time, unable to put it down, as though putting it down would make it more real than holding it. What it meant was that Eleanor had no father. What it meant was that I was 19 years old and a widow with a 4-month-old child in a valley being torn apart by a war that had no visible end. The autumn and winter of 1863 were hard. The armies had moved through the valley repeatedly, and the movement of armies is not kind to farmland or to the people who depend on it. My father's stored grain had been stripped by foraging parties. The summer crops had been disrupted by troop movements. My brother James had come home from the fighting with a wound to his left arm that healed badly and left him with limited use of the hand. We were diminished in every way a family can be diminished, and we managed because that is what people in difficult circumstances do. But managing is not the same as thriving, and I want to be honest about which one we were doing. Then Sheridan came to the valley in the summer of 1864, with orders to destroy it as a source of Confederate supply, and managing became something considerably harder. My father's barn burned in October of 1864. His stored grain went with it. What livestock remained after 2 years of military foraging was not enough to sustain the farm through winter. We were 4 people on land that could barely support itself, with a war still going and no end in sight. And Eleanor was 18 months old and needed everything that children need. I was a burden on that farm, and Eleanor was a further burden. And while my father never said so and never would, I was capable of the arithmetic myself. It was my mother who said what I could not say. She said it one evening in November of 1864, after Eleanor was asleep and the men had gone to bed, when it was just the 2 of us at the kitchen table, with the lamp burning low. She said it quietly, with the full weight of what it cost her, because Eleanor was her grandchild, and she loved her without qualification. She said, "There is a couple in Winchester who have no children, and who have means, and who have asked through the minister whether there is a child in the county who needs a home." I did not speak for a long time. The lamp burned. Outside, the November wind moved through the apple trees, and the sound it made was the sound the valley made in November, which I had known all my life. I have never been able to hear it since without thinking of that evening and what came after it. Finally, I said, "Tell me about them." Their names were George and Catherine Marsh. My mother had learned this from the minister, who had learned it from a colleague in Winchester, who handled the affairs of their congregation. George Marsh was a dry goods merchant who had managed to keep his business functioning through the war years, with a combination of careful management and the practical neutrality that merchants in contested territory sometimes adopted out of necessity. Catherine Marsh was the daughter of a Winchester physician who had died in 1861. They had been married 12 years. They had no children. Catherine had lost 2 pregnancies in the early years of the marriage and had not conceived again. And the minister described her with careful delicacy as a woman whose great capacity for love had not yet found its proper outlet. I asked how old they were. My mother said George was 38 and Catherine 34. I asked what kind of people they were. My mother said the minister spoke of them as people of steady character and genuine kindness. She delivered these words with the care of a woman who understood that they mattered, and that she had an obligation to convey them accurately rather than reassuringly. I sat with this for 3 days. I want to be honest about what those 3 days were like, because I think people sometimes imagine that decisions of this kind arrive in a single moment of clarity, when in fact they are made slowly and painfully, and with a great deal of sitting alone before anyone else is awake, holding a sleeping child, and trying to see forward into a future that will not reveal itself no matter how carefully you look. What I kept returning to was one fact. Eleanor was 18 months old and healthy and bright, and she did not yet understand permanence or loss or what it meant to be taken somewhere else. What she understood was warmth and familiar voices, and the presence of the people she had always known. These things could be provided by someone other than me. I did not want to return to this fact, but it was there, and I was honest enough with myself not to pretend it wasn't. I also knew that the winter ahead was going to be genuinely hard, in ways I could not fully predict, and that my father's farm, for the first time in its history, might not be able to sustain the people who depended on it. I have never said this aloud before. I am saying it now because I want you to understand that I was not a woman who gave her child away carelessly. I was a woman who looked at everything clearly and found that clarity was not a comfort, but simply a requirement. On the third day, I told my mother I would meet the Marshes. They came to the farm on a Saturday in late November, driving a buggy from Winchester, and they were exactly what the minister's description had suggested, and also entirely real, in the way that descriptions of people never quite prepare you for. George Marsh was broad-shouldered, with a careful manner and steady hands, the kind of man who checks that a door is properly latched before walking away from it. Catherine Marsh was small and dark-haired, and she came through the door of our farmhouse, and her eyes went immediately to Eleanor, who was sitting on the kitchen floor, examining a wooden spoon with the focused attention of a child who has recently discovered that wooden spoons are interesting. Catherine sat down on the floor beside her. She did not ask permission, and she did not make a production of it. She simply sat down on the kitchen floor in her good dress and held out her hand, and Eleanor looked at the hand and then at Catherine's face, and then, after a moment of consideration that seemed to involve the full resources of her attention, she placed the wooden spoon into Catherine's outstretched palm. I watched this and did not say anything. We talked for 2 hours. We talked about the war and the state of things in Winchester and the condition of the valley, and we talked around the central subject for a long time before we addressed it directly, which is how these conversations work when the people involved are decent and understand the weight of what is being discussed. When we finally spoke directly, George Marsh said what he intended to provide and what he intended to promise, and he said it plainly, without ornamentation, in the manner of a man who has thought carefully about his words before speaking them. He promised that Eleanor would be loved, educated, and provided for. He promised that she would know she was adopted when she was old enough to understand. He promised that if I ever wanted to know how she was, I could write and they would tell me. He did not promise that I could see her. I understood why. A clean arrangement is more merciful than a complicated one, for the child if not for the mother. I understood this. That is not the same as accepting it easily, but I understood it. Catherine held Eleanor for most of those 2 hours, and Eleanor, who was not a child who went easily to strangers, sat in her lap with a settled quality I had not expected. I have thought about this many times since. Children know things they cannot articulate. Perhaps she knew something. Perhaps it meant nothing at all. I have turned it over for 45 years without arriving at a conclusion. They left in the late afternoon without Eleanor. We had agreed they would come back in 1 week, which would give me time to prepare what she would need and to spend 7 more days with my daughter. Those 7 days are not something I will describe in full. Some things resist description, not because they are beyond language, but because language makes them too small, compresses them into sentences when they actually filled every hour of every day. I will say that I held Eleanor as much as she would allow, and that I memorized her the way you memorize something you understand you are about to lose, the particular weight of her, the smell of her hair, the sound she made falling asleep, the angle of her head when something caught her attention. I memorized these things with the deliberate thoroughness of a woman who knows she will have nothing else. The Marshes returned on the first Saturday of December, 1864. The sky was the flat gray of a valley winter. My mother stood in the doorway. My father stood behind her. James stood at the fence with his damaged arm held close to his side, the way he always held it now. I carried Eleanor out to the buggy. She was wearing the coat my mother had sewn for her, from wool traded for 3 jars of apple preserves. I had braided her hair that morning, the dark hair that was her father's. I carried her out, and I handed her to Catherine Marsh, who took her with both arms and held her against her chest. Eleanor looked at me over Catherine's shoulder. She looked at me with those gray eyes that were my mother's eyes, that particular clear and steady gaze that had been hers from the first hour of her life. She did not cry. She was still looking at me when the buggy turned at the end of the lane and moved out of sight. I went back into the house. I sat at the kitchen table. My mother put her hand on my shoulder and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. We sat together while the gray winter light moved across the floor, and I began what would become 45 years of trying to find my way back to a child I had placed in someone else's arms on a cold December morning, because I did not know what else to do. The first letter I wrote to Catherine Marsh went out in January of 1865. She wrote back in February. Eleanor was well, she said. Eleanor was eating well and sleeping well and had taken to the house without difficulty. She described specific things, small particular details that I read and reread until the paper softened at the folds. The way Eleanor laughed at the cat, the words she had just learned to say. These details were gifts, and I understood them as gifts, and I was grateful for them with a gratitude that had nowhere to go except back into the next letter I wrote. This continued for 3 years, and then it stopped. Catherine Marsh's last letter arrived in the spring of 1868. Eleanor was 5 years old. The letter was like the others, warm and specific, and full of the small details I had come to depend on. Eleanor had started to read. She had a favorite doll whose name she had chosen herself. She had her father's dark hair, and Catherine wrote, a way of tilting her head when she was thinking that was so particular and so entirely her own that it made you want to ask what she was thinking, and whatever she said was always worth the asking. I read this sentence many times. I folded the letter and put it with the others in the box I kept under the bed. I sat down to write my reply. My reply went unanswered. I waited 6 weeks, which was longer than the usual interval, and wrote again. This letter also went unanswered. I waited another month and wrote a third time, a shorter letter, concerned now and not entirely able to conceal the concern in the sentences. No answer came. I did not understand this. I had no framework for it. We had written back and forth for 3 years without interruption, and the silence arrived with no warning and no explanation, as though a door had simply closed. I wrote to the minister in Winchester who had originally brokered the arrangement. His reply came 3 weeks later and said only that the Marsh family had left Winchester some time ago and that he did not have a current address for them. Left Winchester. No current address. I sat with these words for a long time. I turned them over in my mind the way you turn over something that does not make sense, looking for the angle from which it might become comprehensible. People move. This was true. The war had ended 3 years earlier, and the South was rearranging itself, and people were going places they had not expected to go, following opportunities that the reconstruction of commerce and ordinary life was opening in some directions and closing in others. People move, and they do not always think to notify everyone who might be affected by their moving. I understood this. What I could not understand was moving without telling me, without leaving an address, without a final letter. The war was over, and the valley was putting itself back together with the slow and painful efficiency of a place that has been thoroughly damaged and knows there is no choice but to repair. My father's farm had survived, diminished but intact, and in the years after the war we rebuilt what Sheridan's campaign had taken. James managed as best he could with his damaged arm. I worked beside him and beside my father, and I wrote letter after letter to addresses in Winchester and beyond, trying to find where the Marsh family had gone and how to reach them. By 1870, I had been looking for 2 years without result. I had written to churches, to merchants who might have known George Marsh through his dry goods business, to anyone whose name appeared in any connection with the family, in anything I could find, or anyone I could ask. I had traveled to Winchester twice on the train, and walked the streets where the Marsh house had stood, and talked to neighbors who remembered the family, but could tell me only that they had left in 1867, or perhaps 1868. Destination uncertain, possibly Ohio, possibly Pennsylvania. Nobody was quite sure. Ohio or Pennsylvania. Eleanor was somewhere in a large country without clear borders, carried there by people I had trusted with her, people who had been kind, and who had written to me faithfully for 3 years, and who had then, for reasons I could not determine, simply stopped. I want to tell you what the searching was like, because I think it is important that you understand it was not something I did occasionally, or when circumstances permitted. It was something I did constantly, in the margins of every other thing I did, the way certain people carry a particular thought, always at the back of their minds, regardless of what else they are thinking about. The searching was a continuous, low-level activity that ran underneath everything else, the way a river runs underground, beneath a field that looks solid from above. I remarried in 1872. His name was Henry Alcott, a distant cousin of my mother's people, a widower with a farm in the northern part of the county, and a steady and decent character that I respected without quite being able to love, in the way I had loved Thomas. I want to be honest about this. Henry knew this about himself and about me, and he accepted it without complaint, because he was a realistic man who understood that life after loss is not the same as life before it, and did not require that it be. We were good to each other, and we built a life together that was not what either of us had originally imagined, and that was nonetheless real and worth having. We had 2 children, a son named Robert, after my father, born in 1874, and a daughter named Margaret, after my mother, born in 1876. Henry knew about Eleanor from the beginning. I told him before we married, because it seemed to me that a man who was going to share his life with me had a right to know what he was sharing it with, which included this. He listened carefully and asked a few questions, and then said that what I had been done out of necessity, and that he saw no reason to regard it differently, and that if I was still looking for her, which he could see that I was, he would help me look. He was as good as his word. Henry had connections through his business dealings that I did not have, and he wrote letters to people I could not have reached on my own, and made inquiries that opened doors that had been closed to me. Through his efforts, I learned in 1875 that a George Marsh, who had been a dry goods merchant in Winchester, Virginia, had established a new business in Columbus, Ohio, sometime around 1868. This was the first solid piece of information I had obtained in 7 years of looking, and I held on to it with a care that was perhaps disproportionate, but that I make no apology for. I wrote to Columbus, Ohio. I wrote to the Merchants Association there. I wrote to churches of the denomination the Marshes had attended in Winchester. I wrote to the Winchester minister again with the new information to see if he could add anything to it. What came back eventually was a name. A business on High Street, Columbus. George Marsh, Dry Goods and General Merchandise, an address. I wrote to that address in the autumn of 1875 with a letter that I had drafted and redrafted over the course of 3 weeks, trying to find the right tone, which was difficult because there were so many wrong tones available. I did not want to sound accusatory, though I felt accused of something I had not done. I did not want to sound desperate, though I was. I wanted to sound like a woman who had a reasonable request and believed it would be treated reasonably, which was perhaps more optimism than the situation warranted, but which seemed the most useful stance to adopt. I asked about Eleanor. I asked how she was. I asked if I might know where she was, and whether she was well, and what had become of her in the years since the letters stopped. The letter came back unopened. On the envelope, in handwriting I did not recognize, were the words, "Return to sender. No longer at this address." I sat at the kitchen table with the returned letter in my hands, and I did not let myself feel what I wanted to feel, because feeling it fully would have made it impossible to continue, and I had to continue. Eleanor was 12 years old, and somewhere in this country, and I was going to find her. This was not hope exactly. Hope implies uncertainty about whether the thing desired is possible. What I had was more like the decision to continue regardless of whether hope was warranted, which is a different thing and in some ways harder. I told Henry that evening. He put his hand over mine and said, "We will try again." And we did. The years between 1875 and 1908 are not years I can account for in any simple or linear way when it comes to the searching. They were 33 years, which is a long time, and the searching did not proceed at a steady pace or with consistent results. There were periods of progress and periods of nothing, and the periods of nothing were sometimes very long, and I want to be honest about what very long periods of nothing do to a person who is determined to continue anyway. Henry died in 1891. He had been ill for 2 years with a weakness of the lungs that the doctor could slow, but not stop. And he died in September of that year in the bedroom of the farmhouse that had been his father's before it was his, with Robert and Margaret and me beside him, and with the same steady and decent quality he had brought to everything in his life. He was 63 years old. I was 48. We had been married 19 years. I want to say something about Henry Alcott that I have perhaps not said clearly enough. He was not the great love of my life in the way that the phrase is usually meant. Thomas was that, and Thomas has been dead for more years than I have lived since his death, which is a strange arithmetic to contemplate. But Henry was something equally important, and perhaps rarer, which is a genuinely good man who made a life with me on honest terms, and kept every promise he made, and asked nothing of me that I was not able to give. I grieved him truly. I grieve him still. And after he was gone, I continued the searching on my own, because that is what he would have expected of me, and because I did not know how to stop. By 1891, I had established, through many years of letters and inquiries, certain facts about Eleanor's life. I knew she had grown up in Columbus, Ohio. I knew she had attended school there. I knew that George Marsh's dry goods business had prospered through the 1870s and into the 1880s, which meant Eleanor had been raised in a household of reasonable comfort. I knew that Catherine Marsh had died in 1882, which I learned from an obituary in a Columbus newspaper that a correspondent sent me at my request. The obituary mentioned a daughter, Eleanor, surviving at home. Eleanor surviving at home. She had been 19 years old in 1882, and she was alive and in Columbus. And that was more than I had known for certain in a long time. What I did not know was where she went after 1882. George Marsh had sold his business in 1885. According to a man I found through a chain of correspondence who had known him slightly in his commercial dealings, where he had gone after the sale was less clear. Some people said he had moved to stay with family in Pennsylvania. Others said he had retired somewhere in the countryside outside Columbus. Nobody had a current address. And Eleanor would have been 22 in 1885, which meant she might have married by then, or might have moved independently, or might have gone with her father wherever he had gone. A woman of 22 in 1885 was at the age where her name changed, and her location changed, and the thread of her became difficult to follow, even for people who had known her, let alone for someone searching at a distance across 30 years of silence. I looked for her under her given name, and I looked for her under the names of the men she might have married. I looked through church records when I could get access to them, and through county records when those were available, and through the newspaper notices of births and deaths and marriages that newspapers in that era published as a matter of public record. I wrote to churches of every denomination in Columbus and to several in the surrounding counties. I wrote to the school she was said to have attended. I wrote to anyone whose name appeared in any connection with the Marsh family, in anything I could find. My son Robert, who had grown into a practical and capable man, helped me as much as he could. He had a broader network of acquaintance than I did through his own business dealings, and he used it on my behalf without being asked to. My daughter Margaret thought the searching was not entirely healthy, and said so, gently, on more than one occasion. She was not wrong, strictly speaking, but she was also not right in any way that made a difference to whether I continued, because the decision to continue had been made too long ago, and too deeply to be revisited by any argument that did not include the actual location of Eleanor. In 1903, I received a letter from a woman in Winchester who had known Catherine Marsh in the years before the family left for Ohio. She had found my name through the network of correspondence I had been maintaining for decades, the slow and patient accumulation of people who knew that Elizabeth Holloway in Clark County was looking for a woman who had been Eleanor Marsh in Columbus, Ohio, and who might now be something else entirely in some other place. The woman wrote to say that she had recently been in correspondence with an old friend in Columbus who had mentioned knowing a woman who had been Eleanor Marsh before her marriage, and that this woman, now Eleanor something else, was living in a town in central Ohio whose name she provided. I wrote to the town. I wrote to the postmaster, which was the approach I had found most reliable over the years, when an address was uncertain, asking if he knew of a woman by the name Eleanor, who had formerly been Eleanor Marsh of Columbus. The postmaster's reply came 6 weeks later. He said he knew of no one by that name in the town, but would ask around. He asked around and wrote again 2 months after that to say that he had found no one. Another closed door. I had learned by this point in my life not to sit with closed doors for longer than necessary. Grief the closing, note what had been learned, adjust the direction of inquiry, continue. This had been my method for 30 years, and it had kept me functional and would continue to do so. In 1905, Robert located, through a contact in Columbus, a man who had done business with George Marsh in the 1880s and who remembered the family. He wrote to this man on my behalf, and the man replied with a letter that contained more information than anything I had received in years. George Marsh had died in 1889, he said. Eleanor had been married the previous year, in 1888, to a man named William Carpenter, a school teacher from a town called Granville in Licking County, Ohio. The man had attended a church supper at which Eleanor and her new husband had been guests, and remembered them clearly because Eleanor had a particular quality of stillness and attention that made her memorable. A particular quality of stillness and attention. I read this sentence 4 times. I did not cry, because I had long since moved past the kind of emotion that expresses itself in crying over pieces of paper. But I felt something shift in my chest that I recognized as the particular movement that hope makes when it has been very still for a very long time and is suddenly required to move again. Eleanor Carpenter. Granville, Licking County, Ohio. I wrote to Granville in the autumn of 1905. I wrote carefully, explaining who I was, and what my connection to Eleanor was, and what I was asking. I addressed the letter to Eleanor Carpenter in care of the Granville Post Office. The letter was returned 6 weeks later. Eleanor Carpenter no longer resided in Granville. The postmaster had no forwarding address. I sat with this for a week. Then I wrote to the churches in Granville and to the school where William Carpenter had supposedly taught, and to anyone else I could think of who might know where a school teacher and his wife had gone when they left a small town in central Ohio. What came back eventually after another 2 years of letters and waiting was a name. A woman in Winchester who had distant family in Ohio, who knew someone who had known someone. The name she gave me was not a town, but a person. A woman who had been a close friend of Eleanor Carpenter's in Granville before Eleanor and her husband moved away, and who was still living in the area and whose address the Winchester woman had somehow obtained. I wrote to this woman in the autumn of 1907. I waited through the winter. In the spring of 1908, she replied. Eleanor was alive. She was living in a town in Knox County, Ohio, where her husband had taken a position at a school. She had 3 children. The woman gave me an address. I held the letter in both hands at the kitchen table and read it 3 times. Then I put it down carefully. I went out to the porch and stood in the spring morning and looked at the valley, which was green, in the way it is green in May, with that particular depth of color that comes after a long winter. And I stood there for a long time. I was 65 years old. Eleanor was 45. I had been looking for 43 years. I had her address on a piece of paper on the kitchen table. I went back inside and I sat down and I began to write the most important letter of my life. I wrote the letter over the course of a week. I wrote it and put it aside and came back to it and wrote it again, because the first version was too long, and the second was too short, and the third was too much about my own grief, and the fourth was too carefully controlled, in a way that did not sound like a person, and more like a legal document. The fifth version was honest. It said who I was and what I had done and why and what the years since had been. It said that I did not expect anything. It said that I had looked for her for 43 years, not because I believed she owed me anything, but because she was my daughter, and I had never been able to stop. It said that if she did not want to hear from me, I would understand and would not write again. It said that if she was willing to write back, even once, I would be grateful for the rest of my life. I sent it in April of 1908. I waited. The summer passed. I told myself this was not unusual. Letters went astray. People had lives that made prompt response difficult. A woman with 3 children and a husband and a household had claims on her time that did not always permit immediate attention to unexpected correspondence from strangers who claimed to be her birth mother. I understood this. I told myself I understood this. I waited through June and July and August, and the valley was hot in the way it is hot in those months, and I worked in my garden, and I helped Margaret with her children when she needed help, and I waited. In September, a letter came from Knox County, Ohio. I recognized the county from the address on the envelope before I opened it, and I sat down before I opened it because I wanted to be sitting when I read whatever was inside. It was not from Eleanor. It was from her husband, William Carpenter. He wrote to tell me that Eleanor had passed away in the previous March, 1 month before my letter arrived. She had been ill since the winter with a fever that had settled in her lungs and that the doctor had not been able to turn. She had died on the 17th of March, 1908, at the age of 45, leaving William and 3 children whose ages he listed: Thomas, 19, Catherine, 16, and Ruth, 12. She had named her children Thomas and Catherine and Ruth. I read this detail several times. I do not know what Eleanor knew or did not know about her origins. Catherine Marsh had promised she would be told she was adopted when she was old enough to understand. Whether she had been told, and what she had been told, and whether she had known enough of my history to know the names that would have meaning to me, I cannot say. Perhaps it was coincidence, perhaps it was not. I have thought about it many times without arriving at any conclusion that feels more reliable than any other. William Carpenter wrote that he had read my letter after Eleanor's death and had found among Eleanor's papers, in a box she had kept for many years, several of my earlier letters, the ones I had written in the years when I still had an address to write to, before the silence began. She had kept them. They were worn at the folds, in the way that papers get worn when they are handled many times. She had kept them. She had read them enough times that they were worn at the folds. I sat at the kitchen table for a very long time after reading William Carpenter's letter. The September light came through the kitchen window, At the angle it comes in September, lower than summer, and with that particular quality of distance that autumn light has in the valley, as though the sun is beginning to consider other arrangements. I sat in that light and I held the letter, and I did not try to think clearly or to arrive at any position regarding what I felt. What I felt was not one thing. It was many things simultaneously, which is how the largest feelings work. There was grief, which was enormous and not surprising. There was something that was almost relief, which surprised me and which I have since come to understand, because the searching was over. And there is a kind of terrible peace in that even when the ending is not the one you were looking for. There was a strange and complicated gratitude for William Carpenter, who had written to a stranger with care and specificity, and who had told me about the box of letters, which he did not have to tell me. And there was something else, the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I find hardest to name. She had kept my letters. I wrote back to William Carpenter. I thanked him for writing, and I asked if I might know something more about Eleanor's life. Not the ending of it, but the middle of it. What she had been like, what she had cared about, whether she had been happy. He wrote back a month later with 3 pages that I have read so many times. They are nearly as worn as my original letters apparently were in Eleanor's box. He wrote about her carefully and with evident love, the way a man writes about a woman he has lost too early, and whom he is still, even at the remove of several months, in the process of losing. He said she was a reader, which did not surprise me. He said she was quiet in company, but not shy, which is a distinction worth making. He said she had a particular quality of attention when she listened to someone speak that made people feel that what they were saying mattered, which is a rare thing and a valuable one. He said she had told him once that she sometimes thought about the woman who had given birth to her, and that she hoped she was well. She hoped I was well. I went to Ohio in November of 1908. I went alone on the train, which took 2 days, and I arrived in Knox County on a gray morning and found a man at the station who knew where the Carpenter house was and took me there for a small fee. It was a white house on a tree-lined street in a town that was quiet in the way of Midwestern towns in November, when the leaves are down and the streets have that particular emptiness that comes before winter settles in completely. William Carpenter met me at the door. He was a tall man with a careful face and the eyes of someone who has been recently and thoroughly saddened, and who is managing it with as much dignity as the situation allows. He took my hand and said he was glad I had come, and I believed him. We sat in the parlor, and he brought tea, and we talked for 2 hours. He told me more about Eleanor than he had been able to put in a letter. Specific things, the texture of her daily life, and the things she found funny, and the things that moved her, and the way she was with the children, which was patient and attentive and full of a warmth that he said she seemed to have been born with, as though it required no effort from her and was simply the condition she inhabited. He showed me a photograph. It was taken in 1900, he said, in Columbus, when they had gone back to visit friends. Eleanor was standing in a garden in summer, looking slightly away from the camera, her dark hair pinned up in the style of that era. She was 37 years old in the photograph. She was tall and dark-haired, her father's coloring, and she had her head tilted slightly to one side, at a particular angle, a particular quality of attention. I held the photograph and did not speak for a moment. William Carpenter said quietly, "You can keep it if you would like." I kept it. I have it here with me now, in the box on the shelf above my bed, with the letter he wrote, and the letters she kept, and the things I have accumulated in 71 years of being a person in the world. I met the children before I left. Thomas, who was 19, and who had his mother's eyes. Catherine, 16, who was going to be beautiful in the way Eleanor apparently had been. Ruth, 12, who tilted her head at a particular angle when she was introduced to me, that made me put my hand on the back of the nearest chair to steady myself. I said goodbye to William Carpenter at the gate. He said that if I wished to write to the children as they grew older, he would not object to it. I thanked him and told him I would think about it carefully, because the children had lost their mother, and a stranger appearing in correspondence was not necessarily what they needed. And I wanted to be sure before I did anything that I was thinking about what they needed rather than what I needed. I have thought about it. I think about it still. I came home on the train and arrived back in the valley on a Thursday evening in late November, and the mountains were dark against the last light in the way they are in November when the leaves are fully gone. And I stood on the platform and looked at them for a moment before I gathered my bag and went to find someone to take me home. I have been asked why I never stopped looking. I have been asked this question many times by people who mean it kindly and by people who mean something more pointed by it. The honest answer is that I am not certain I could have stopped. Eleanor was my daughter. Whatever the circumstances of her leaving, whatever the years of silence meant or did not mean, she was my daughter. And that is a fact that does not respond to the passage of time, or the accumulation of unanswered letters, or the closing of one door after another. What I know now that I did not know when the searching began is that she was all right. She had a husband who loved her, and children she named with care, and a box of letters that were worn at the folds. She had a quality of attention that made people feel that what they were saying mattered. She had a life that was hers, fully and completely, and she lived it. This is not the ending I was looking for. It is the ending I have. And I have learned in 71 years that these two things are rarely the same, and that the work of a life is to find what is true in the ending you have, rather than grieving forever what might have been true in the ending you wanted. I grieve her. I will grieve her until I am finished with grieving, which I expect will be the same day I am finished with everything else. But I am grateful. I am grateful that she was loved. I am grateful that she kept the letters. I am grateful that her youngest child tilts her head the way Eleanor did at that particular angle, the one that is entirely her own. It did not disappear. It went on. That is enough. That has to be enough, and I have found in the end that it is.